While Peter is making his way to the stage, I will do the hardest thing I have to do at the HRO Today Forum, which is read his bio, okay? Because it is long. Peter is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and the Director of the Wharton Center for Human Resources. He's also a research associate. He's also been a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, served as a senior advisor to the Kingdom of Bahrain for employment policy, and since 2007 is a distinguished scholar of the Ministry of Manpower for Singapore. He has degrees in industrial relations from Cornell and in labor economics from Oxford, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He was a staff member on the U.S. Secretary of Labor's Commission on Workforce Quality and Labor Market Efficiency. He was formerly the co-director of the U.S. Department of Education's National Center on Educational Quality of the Workforce. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Department of Education's National Center. Oh, God, yeah, you think?
Just saying enough.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, there's another 9 pages, so I'm done. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Peter Cappelli.
Thank you.
Please have a seat.
I think the goal here of this session is what Click and Clack. How many of you are fans of Click and Clack on National Public Radio? Used to call Stump the Chump, and that means you ask questions, and we talk about what the answers might be. And I think having done this last year, Elliot, I think the goal as well is to remind you there's a lot of wisdom in the room, so we're going to ask if you have questions, if other folks in the room have experiences that might answer them as well. But if I could do one thing before we start, and that is to just ask you at your table to just quickly go around and introduce yourselves to each other, because I don't think you've done that yet, and this will help you figure out who has answers to the questions at your table. Can we do that for just a second?
By all means, yeah.
HRO Today gets 10% commission on any jobs that take place as a result of this meeting here. So I could start out by telling you some things that I'm seeing going on, but maybe we could also start with just questions that you folks have. I mean, it seems to me we are at a kind of interesting moment in human resources now. I'll tell you what the punchline I think is, and that is for a long time in human resources, we didn't really have a clear idea what we were supposed to be doing to support the business. So we hear all the time about the importance of supporting business strategy, and in the academic world as well, there was a long series, about a decade or so, where people were trying to figure out how you do that. And the problem was that companies abandoned traditional notions of strategy. So the idea that companies have a consistent strategy that they're going to stick to for a long period of time really doesn't happen very much anymore. And the idea that they've got long-term plans that we're supposed to build around really doesn't happen much anymore. Most companies that have got long-term plans update them every year or so. And if you're updating your plan, that means you're changing your plan, right? So trying to figure out how we support the business when they don't have these strategies is an interesting challenge. And I think we got some ideas now about how to do it that have to do with ways in which companies are focusing on projects, right, as opposed to long-term strategies. And particularly this notion of Agile, which we'll talk about a little later, I hope, is something which is changing lots and lots of organizations, right? But let me pause here and see what things you folks would like to talk about.
I have some questions that have been sent in
by
our studio audience.
Okay.
So where is Anand Sethi? VP and former head of talent for Infosys Public Services. Where are you, Anand? All right, you want to ask your question, Anand?
Yeah.
Okay. This is, maybe a little bit politically charged, but the Pandora's box is open. So, irrespective of the regulations that are going to come out of the new administration, the American sentiment has opened up. So, there are more conversations about opening more, developing more talent within the U.S. So my question is, now that the new administration's opened the Pandora's box, and with the highlights on immigrations, what is the HRO community doing today to help ensure a quick buildup of local talent systems, processes, and also more efficient talent in the U.S.?
Well, I guess that's a question for maybe folks in the room. But my guess is if I am sitting in an HR job in a company, what I would be doing is just completely ignoring what's going on in the political world in Washington. It is so unpredictable, right? And we have to figure out how to deal with uncertainty, but the uncertainty here is so great. You think about, for example, all the regulations that President Obama had promulgated that were supposed to take effect about January of this year, and lots of companies spend a lot of time preparing for those, and then President Trump basically erases them all with the stroke of a pen, and all that effort was wasted, right? So I'm not sure that I would do very much for my own company. I think you're sort of asking the broader question about is there something that HR as a community could do? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, partly because companies are in such different places, and it's not clear to me that there is a uniform HR view on these questions. But maybe somebody else has an answer to that or a view themselves. Yes, sir. Yep.
Hi, I'm Carl Zongi with Advantage XPO. Where I think companies need to go to create talent today within the U.S. are the millennials working the colleges and universities, and not just going and setting up a booth, but aggressively building a relationship with their infrastructure and working with them on building a plan on how to take students that are in their sophomore, junior, and senior year, get them to intern and develop them. And there's a path, I think a great path to get great talent today. Because my experience so far has been very positive working with the millennials. Yeah. Thank you.
So you know, to the point that Anand, and thank you for the comment. You know, you're right. If we've learned nothing from the bizarre 2016 election cycle, it's that at the end of the day, a number of Americans, and I'm not going to get into the debate about the popular vote, trusted the business community, and arguably anyone from the business community, more than they trusted a career politician, okay? And things have dramatically changed. But if immigration really does get clamped down upon, you know, what are companies doing to make sure, particularly for engineering talent, which there is a scarcity of in the US, how are you addressing it? A lot of you are in Silicon Valley, high-tech communities, or very technology dependent. So I think it's a great question to ask the audience. Has anyone sort of had a strategy session about addressing it?
Well, let me just say a couple of things about that question, which is what should my company do for my own company, right? And that is one of the things we have to recognize is that training in the US has declined precipitously. And so the models that many of you grew up with, where you went to work for a company and they put you through a long training program, those have almost completely disappeared. So we moved from a model where companies had apprenticeship programs, which have also completely fallen off the cliff, and hired people and trained and developed them, to a model where companies are expecting to hire people from the outside who already have the skills to do the job. So some of you have probably heard this statistic before, but if you look at the data from some of the applicant tracking software companies, but also from places like Career Crossroads, in their surveys of their own members, they conclude that about 2/3 of the jobs in US companies right now, vacancies, are filled from the outside. And if you turn the clock back a generation ago, that number was about 10%. So it used to be about 90% of vacancies were filled internally by promotions and rotational assignments and internal development, and that number has gone from 10% external at entry-level jobs to 2/3 external now at all levels of the organization. And one of the great challenges that I think you have as organizations is that could work for you if you're the only company doing outside hiring in your community. But once everybody else tries to meet their talent needs by hiring from each other, that just can't work anymore. And so any sensible company, I think, has got to get back into the business of developing talent. You can do it efficiently. You look at our consulting companies, for example, the Accentures of the world, the McKinseys, all those folks. The idea that you're going to lose people does not negate the opportunities to train, right? Those companies lose 95% of their talent in about 5 years, and they still make money off of them because they figured out ways in which they can train in cost-effective ways, and that's learning by doing. So we have to get back into that model of stretch assignments. That's what apprenticeships were like, right? And we have to get into that. And I think if you're not doing that, if you're relying simply on trying to hire the people you need from the outside all the time, this is a losing cycle because everybody's trying to do the same thing. And it's almost impossible to imagine how you're going to win doing that.
But doesn't that also play into the whole issue that a lot of people are dealing with, the reduction in tenure, average tenure for professionals? Because if companies are not hiring internally, if they're not developing talent, if they're not promoting talent into the next job, if they're just hiring someone in over their head,
right,
then why are companies complaining that people only stay 2 to 3 years?
Well, right. This is a little hypocritical, isn't it?
Yeah, you're a bunch of hypocrites. What's wrong with you people?
Because one person's outside hiring strategy is another company's retention problem, right? So we're driving retention collectively as a problem because we're hiring away from each other all the time. So but I don't think that's a sustainable long-term solution. Right?
But do we have a question back there?
Just to add to the conversation. It's Cox from Zurich Insurance. And, in line with the apprenticeship program, so we worked with the Obama administration. We took on the European model, and apprenticeships in corporate America is actually a reality. We, us and Aon, have picked up the apprenticeship program, and we're into our 3rd cycle. So not just from the millennials, right, from the college, but, sometimes we have to get past the university and actually think about long-term strategy. In Europe, in the Swiss communities, you have a lower unemployment rate for those who are actually going into apprenticeships and then working on to get their 4-year degree. So at Zurich, we actually now work with local 2-year universities to bring in talent through a real apprenticeship. So yeah. It can be done.
Yeah, and I think there is a public policy mistake that we made a long time ago. I don't know if you know this, but we pretty much got rid of vocational education in American high schools. Vocational programs were seen at the time, and this is, there's a lot of blame to go around, but this blame came from the left. And that was the belief that vocational programs were tracking kids into careers that were not going to be as good as the careers that were available for the college bound. So we ended up gutting the vocational education programs. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is that we pushed a lot of people into the college track who couldn't go there. They either couldn't afford it or were not able to. And we have dismal completion rates in the U.S. out of colleges, especially out of community colleges, where a small fraction, about 10% of kids who enter those programs actually end up with a degree. And if you've got kids who are entering college now, this is not a statistic you probably want to hear, but only 40% of full-time students in the U.S., full-time students, graduate from 4-year colleges in 4 years, right? And some of it is not the fault of the kids. It's not just that they're lazing around. Believe me, I had 2 kids, and I told them you're going to graduate in 4 years, and neither of them did. And one of them was because it wasn't really his fault. It was he couldn't get the courses in his major in the right lines in order to finish in time. He switched majors and he couldn't get those courses. By the way, I wrote a whole book about this called Will College Pay Off? $29.95. All right. Pergamon Press, a great graduation gift if you're looking for what to give your kids.
And also, I was about to plug your other book, Why Good People Can't Get Jobs, but you have a new book that you decided to plug instead.
Yeah, there you go.
Because you talk about the mentorship and apprenticeship programs in that book.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Where is Jeff Juranek from Health First? There he is. We get a microphone over to Jeff.
All right, good morning. Workforce planning is a successful component for RPO partnerships. Do you see this as an area of continued emphasis in the current climate of HR and HR analytics?
Well, let me say something about planning in general, right? Planning requires, in order for planning to work as we traditionally think about it, you have to have a very good sense of where you're going to be a few years out, right? And if you've got a lot of uncertainty, traditional planning models don't work particularly well, right? So the question is, how do we respond to uncertainty as opposed to just ignoring it? So just ignoring uncertainty means we'll take our best guess and we'll just assume it's going to be true and work our way through the program, right? And the problem with that is it's often worse than doing nothing. Because if the odds on being right are pretty small, if you've only got, let's say, a 30% chance that your best guess is going to be true, and you spend a lot of investment and you make a lot of fixed costs in the direction of that goal and it turns out not to be true, you're probably worse off than if you never did a plan in the first place, right? So, and by the way, the error rate on even a typical SKU code, right, a typical product, even before the Great Recession, 1 year forecast, the error rate on a 1 year forecast on a product was over 30%, right? So I think that means we have to think about planning differently. And some of this is about embracing uncertainty. Uncertainty is different than risk, right? Risk is what are the odds my house is going to burn down? There's a history base on that. You can figure that out with some pretty good reliability. Uncertainty is, where will the global economy be in 3 years, right? We don't have a good knowledge base for making those predictions. And by the way, if you don't know the answer to that question, your business forecasts can't be very accurate because they all hinge on where's the economy going to be a few years out. So then you have to start thinking about ways to address uncertainty. And some of that has to do with things like scenario planning, for example, a technique you might know, which is anticipating different outcomes in the future, not just what is our best guess, but what is our second best guess and our third best guess. And sometimes together, the second and third best guesses turn out to be pretty similar, and in which cases, maybe that's the way you want to bet. Together, they're more likely than what you thought was your best guess. So scenario planning are ways to do this. There are all kinds of other techniques of risk management, right, which have to do with placing bets in different ways and doing things with portfolio approaches and stuff like that. But I would say the usual approach of planning, let's just take our best guess and assume it's true and head down that path, is a losing proposition. And part of the reason it's a losing proposition in human resources is your businesses don't do that, right? They don't stick with a 5-year plan. They keep updating their plans all the time. And if you are trying to build an HR pipeline around a 5-year plan that the business leaders have abandoned after 1 year, you are surely going to be wrong. And if you are wrong, you're going to be blamed, even though it's not your fault, right? So one other thing that you can do on this is simulations. And simulations are very simple, or could be very simple. Here's the simplest version. Somebody in your business is probably giving you a business forecast that says, here's our plan where things are going to be in 5 years, right? And they're expecting you to build off that plan. If you get that plan, you should ask them 2 questions. First, you say, thanks very much, this is great. And then you want to ask them, the first question is, what would you say are the 2 biggest assumptions on which this plan hinges? And they probably, if they're thoughtful about this, know what those assumptions are, like who's our biggest customer here and what happens if we lose that. And the second question you want to ask them is, okay, what if those assumptions turn out to be wrong? How does that change the forecast, right? And if they answer that question, what you've instantly got is a kind of 4x4 or 2x2 box with 4 different estimates now of where the business might be. And if nothing else, you have reminded them that they're guessing, right? That they don't know for sure where the business is going to be, right? And what simulations will allow you to do is, and there are some companies that are good at this. We have anybody from Dow Chemical in the room? Dow has been one of the leaders in this, and at least historically, Capital One as well. Anybody else? Anybody from Capital One in the room? They were the leaders in doing these workforce simulations. Here's what a workforce simulation does. It's the same thing as a forecast, except it allows you to play with the assumptions. And what the HR people there said was, the beauty of having these kind of simulations was that the line managers could play with them before they made their business decisions. right? So they could say, okay, here's where we want to go with the business, and then they could look at the simulation that says, wow, that would mean we'll need an extra 300 salespeople by the end of this year. Can we do that? I don't think so. Well, then maybe we better adjust our business plan, right? So it brought the human resource issues into the front of the conversation rather than where they typically are now, is at the end of the conversation. And it's your problem to deliver on them. And it's your problem then to go back and say, oh, by the way, that business plan you carefully worked out, it's not going to work because we can't get the HR needs met on this. It's just not probable to make it work. So I would try to do whatever you can to get in on the front of the conversation rather than where we typically are now, which is at the back of the conversation, because that's also a proposition that's got very little upside and lots of downside.
But aren't you contradicting yourself?
No. How's that? Go ahead.
All right, well, let me explain why you're contradicting yourself before you answer. So in the first question, you said that we've lost something with about training, that 2/3 of the jobs are filled externally,
Yeah.
that companies are essentially not really hiring people, apprenticing them, training them up, building them, and creating careers. And then you just said, well, you really can't plan ahead. And many of the people here work for publicly traded companies where literally quarterly earnings has become actually an obstacle rather than opportunity for success in HR, because things shift constantly and no one can plan ahead. You wrote a book that had the age of uncertainty in the title, right? Mm-hmm. So if we really live in the age of uncertainty, how do you do the first thing, which is start building the workforce for the future through apprenticeship programs, mm-hmm. and the second thing where you said, well, you can't really plan.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so now I'm going to ask you again, are you contradicting yourself?
No, here's why.
Okay.
Apprenticeship programs, by the way, apprenticeship programs are the very first step, right? And this is to take you from high school people or to college people into the very first job in the organization, right? And if you don't think you are going to have those people in 3 years or 2 years, you're not going to be in business, right? This is the entry-level jobs, right? And so if you're going to need some entry-level jobs, and if not, then you got a real problem. However, I'm not suggesting that you make big expensive investments in these things, right? So the thing about apprenticeship programs, as you probably know, is apprenticeship programs are paid for by whom, do you know? They're paid for, the real ones, by the individual apprentice who is doing work of value as they go along. So you take your typical McKinsey consultant, right? That's a young person who is being paid $100 an hour and they're billing their time at $200 an hour, right? That's how those firms make money. That's how they make profits, right? So if you're training in ways that are not making big fixed investments in you, then you don't need to worry so much about that long-term planning. If you are making long-term traditional human resource pipeline investments of the kind we made a generation ago, right, where you're putting people through expensive training programs and you're planning now about what they're going to do in 10 years, then you have exactly the problem that you're pointing out, right? And that is, it's quite likely you're going to be wrong. And by the way, this is what happened to human resources in the late 1970s and early 80s. And what blew up that old model is the companies turned out to be completely wrong about their 10-year forecasts for talent, managerial talent in particular, which they were expecting was going to grow at a 6% rate. And it turned out it was flat, and they were stuck with all these mid-level managers because it turned out the plans were wrong, right? So if you can make plans which are investments which are general, as we're not trying to figure out, as within succession planning, who will fill that job in 5 years, but you're trying to say, let's see if we can get a group of people who can do our entry-level jobs, right? And we're going to do that in a way where the employees are making the investments themselves through apprentice programs or stretch assignments, and it's not a lot of classroom time where we're paying them. You can certainly do that, right? But we've given that up as well, I'm afraid.
It's very interesting when I listen to talent acquisition leaders or CHROs talk about talent. They always talk about experienced talent. When you talk to a labor economist about talent, they talk about entry-level talent,
Yep.
right? And that's a big disconnect. Right. In the community that I think people need to think about.
Right. And by the way, in the policy world, there's a sort of assumption that whenever you folks hire, you're hiring from the unemployed or you're hiring right from college. which of course isn't true. Almost nobody's hiring from that group, right?
All right, and the next question is actually also from Jeff. Juranek, Jeff, do you want to, can we get a microphone up here? And this is one that's, you know, hopefully going to scare everyone in the room. Go ahead, Jeff, just scare us now.
Yeah, well, all right, here goes the scary. Now, there appears to be an increased realization of robotics and automation entering and enhancing the HR and talent acquisition space. Which technology or area do you feel is most closely poised to be integrated in 2017, 2018?
To be integrated or to go away, or what do you think? Which do you mean?
To be integrated so that other things are taken away. The automation will...
And this is on talent acquisition, just on talent acquisition?
Yeah, correct.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I've got the greatest answer on that. Let me just say something more general about these automation stories, and that is that these have been going on since the 1700s. These stories about technology will eliminate all jobs, right? And then there's usually a pushback a few years after that, after tight labor markets, saying there won't be enough jobs for people to go around, and then there won't be enough people for the jobs to go around, and we swing back and forth these things, right? If you look over time, it's easy to believe that we always are living in the moment of greatest technological change. But it turns out that that's really not true. There were some interesting stories in The Economist, a series in the Wall Street Journal, talking about innovation in the global economy, that actually it's dropped quite a bit in the last 20 years or so. The peak of innovation in the business world in our lifetime was the 1960s. And we've got lots of new innovations in how to send social media to each other, but that's really been largely it, right? So it doesn't appear that we are poised on the edge of doing something really, really different in terms of the way business is being done. And the changes that really matter are ones that you can see coming, right? That they take a long time to roll out. You're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and discover that there's a robot driving the UPS truck, right? That's not going to happen. It's the kind of stuff that takes a very long time to do. You know, my sense is the biggest changes in talent acquisition have already happened, right? And those are around the ability to search for people, and those are driven really by databases like LinkedIn, right? And once you have that database, lots of things changed. It wasn't the IT around that, it was simply the database as a way of searching and finding people. You know, I think what is the cool stuff right now, if you're just interested in cool, is the ability to find people through search technologies in the labor force someplace who have very particular skills that you're after, right? And in Silicon Valley, there's all kinds of efforts underway to find certain kinds of programmers, very narrow set of skills, and where those people hang out and how to find them. And that has already been automated, I think. And it's possible as we go further down the food chain, we'll start seeing that for nurses, particularly sort of healthcare workers, which are really in demand. That sort of stuff. But does that eliminate recruiters? You know, simply finding where somebody is doesn't replace the ability to actually judge what they're like as a candidate and sell them on the job, right? So I think what is going to be automated, and has sort of already happened, is the ability to find people. But what happens after that still is pretty human, at least as far as I can see.
So you mentioned agility, and I want to get to a question on agility. Where is Jim Hasboon, CHRO for Hyundai Capital? Jim, raise your hand.
Yep.
That's right, he's right over
Yep.
here. Can we get a microphone over to him? Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
So one of my questions was around change. Hyundai Capital is an organization that's gone through breakneck speed of change over the last decade. And I look at a lot of my colleagues in other industries. Many of them are dealing with an increased pace of change and transformation, some of it due to, you know, the technology, digital revolution. In other cases, you know, the life cycle of industries is going up and down very quickly. You look at companies like Blockbuster and others that have, you know, lived their life cycle much faster than historically has happened.
Yep.
My question is, what can we do as HR leaders to better equip our organizations, not thinking purely from a myopic HR inward, but outward towards the organization, what can we do to make the organization more agile, more adaptable, and more pliable to the realities of what's happening in the marketplace?
Well, let's first.
That's a simple question.
Yeah, right.
What are you hesitating for?
Let's first deal with the word agile, right? Because agile has two different meanings in the world of business right now. There's agile the way you used it, which is let's just become more adaptable as organizations. And there's agile the way it is used in project management, which means something quite specific, right? And agile in terms of flexible, most businesses are pretty flexible already. I think at least in terms of the willingness of the organization to blow itself up, right, seems to be almost without limit, right? Lay people off, hire new ones in, right? Let's just have a show of hands. How many of you here have worked for at least 3 different employers over the course of your career? Let's just have a show of hands, right? How many of you have worked for 5 or more? Let's see. Right? How many of you are expecting to work for a new one by the time this session is over? You know, a generation ago, you never would have seen that. And that is the primary way that folks in the C-suite have achieved flexibility, right? Is that they've just got closed down things, opened up new ones. And that, I'm afraid, is still a lot of the way in which they think about doing it. The other way in which you could achieve that kind of agility is internally, right? And that is by having people who are cross-trained and having people who can move into different roles. And that requires some investments up front. You know, there's a fascinating story about what Diane Gerson did at IBM about retraining some of their people. So they had a group of IT people whose skills had become obsolete in the sense that the IT had moved on to other programming skills. And so the CFO approach to this was lay those people off and let's go hire new ones, right? And Diane said to the CFO, look, I can guarantee you a 2 times return on investment if you will let me retrain these people. And what is the case for that? They're all good employees. The ones we want to keep are all good employees. They know our systems, they know IBM, they know the clients. The problem is you don't want to pay for the training. Here's how we'll do it. We'll tell those folks who would like to get new training that we will pay them for 4 days a week of work. On the 5th day, we will offer retraining for them. They're going to be retrained on their own time, right? Now you might say the company ought to pay for everything, but this was a deal that they could cut with the CFO. And given the way training works these days, the main beneficiary of training is the recipient, right? Because they are not locked into the company and they can go someplace else. And they bought that, and it worked out terrifically for the company and for the people, right? So that they got new skills, they were able to keep those people and keep the organization together, and they were able to keep the CFO happy as well, right? So I think there are some innovative ways that we can become more flexible and adaptable without the obvious choice of just laying everybody off and going outside and hiring new people. As the labor market gets tighter, it gets a little harder to do that. And one of the things that we know is it's pretty expensive now to go outside and try to find those people, and the costs of turnover are getting bigger. I hope we will say something about the other kind of agility, though. Is that on our list?
By all means.
Does anybody have experience with this agility, any tech companies here, in the way in which the Adobe folks talk about agility? Do you? And where do you work? Sorry. You were Accenture. Okay, and Accenture has sort of bought this approach?
Yes, agile deployment and iterative.
Yeah. So my colleague Anna Tavis and I, we wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review in the fall about performance management, which I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. And we are going back out to look at that. We started to look at companies that were giving up performance appraisals. And let me just give you a hint as to what we're finding on there. And that is kind of the symptom of a much bigger change. And the bigger change seems to be, in a huge number of companies across the industries, this adaptation of what Adobe folks meant about agile systems. This is a way of doing project management. And it is a way of doing project management by basically giving up the planning process, right? And that is an idea where the priority is, as in software, to build something quickly, stand it up, then get feedback, fix it, right? And you probably heard the expressions for steps in the process like sprints. That is, it's sort of unpredictable moments in projects where you suddenly need a lot of resources to break through something, and then after that, maybe you don't need quite so many, right? So it is a process that is built heavily around feedback. It is a project management process that gets rid of a lot of the planning all the way up to financial planning. And what this means for human resources is it is a different model for organizing things. And the reason these companies have given up on annual performance appraisals, as Susan Peters at GE said, because they've given it up as well, for the same reason they bought this Agile approach. So we don't do any projects on an annual basis anymore. Nothing's on a predictable annual cycle. So why do we have an annual cycle for assessing our employees? It doesn't make any sense. We ought to be thinking about what they're doing project by project by project, right? So this is it seems to us to be a pretty profound change, and we're seeing it in lots of organizations. The big driver is it a priority for you to be more innovative? Now, a lot of businesses where it's not a priority, right? If you're in the oil business, for example, you don't need a lot of innovation. You've got huge investments, long-term investments. But in other industries, this innovation becomes a much bigger priority, and being able to do things faster becomes a priority as well, including companies like Procter & Gamble, surprisingly, and GE, we think of as kind of a tech manufacturing company. And that is really putting a lot of pressure on human resources to change. So you can see articles about Agile recruiting, something that GE has done now. They've changed their recruiting function to fit around this Agile model. And there are Agile approaches in companies to employee benefits, and IBM has sort of redesigned their whole HR team and systems around using Agile approaches to build human resources. That is, not a lot of planning, a lot of standing stuff up, trying it out, not even pilots, but fixing things along the way based on feedback from employees, right? And this is really something which seems quite different. So I think if you ask, what's the big trend I'm seeing, this seems to be it. Not everywhere, and it might not make sense for a lot of companies to do, but we're seeing this in lots and lots of places, and it is really making big demands on human resources to adapt to this new model. It's not a strategy, right? It is a way of doing business, which demands different things from human resources. Yeah, question? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Pat Roy. I'm VP of HR for a manufacturing company. And over this past fiscal year, I introduced performance reviews for a performance process, really quarterly reviews. And one of the big pieces of that is desired outcomes. What is it that you're going to focus on? So kind of like what you're saying, project management almost. But we removed the rating numbers.
Yeah.
Now our production folks all still have their traditional, because I'm trying to see how this fits for our organization.
Yeah.
But my engineers want numbers.
Okay.
And so they're kind of pushing me now about, can we bring the numbers back, because it's going to be salary review time. How are people handling that, the folks that have removed the rating numbers? Because I think it's just distracting. People get too obsessed about that. It gets in the way of the performance discussion and the results. But how do people deal with that salary review time without having the ratings?
Well, just to do a commercial, we're talking about this tomorrow. We have a whole session about this tomorrow. But basically, the companies that have done it, like General Electric ran a pilot on this with 80,000 employees. And what they discovered is that the supervisors had no trouble whatsoever allocating pay. That in lots of organizations, supervisors actually work backwards from the pay decisions anyway. They figure out what kind of pay increase they want to give me, and then they give me the number in order to make that, the performance appraisal score in order to make that work, right? So a lot of people say, particularly employee relations people say, well, you're not defended unless you got a number. And the lawyers I talk to say, well, you know, part of the problem is unless you've got a really fair system with those numbers, the numbers will hang you. And let me tell you about what I've seen looking at data on companies. And most companies you look at, you see that women and minorities get lower performance appraisal scores. And you also see that women and minorities get lower merit pay increases for the same appraisal scores. And if you've got that kind of data, you are absolutely cooked, right? If somebody sues you, you are dead. So the data you've got can hang you as well. Data doesn't protect you unless the data shows that everything you're doing is completely objective and consistent, right? So the lawyer, the kind of lawyery employee relations view here is not really defendable. But here's just a piece of career advice, I think. If you are in HR and you're thinking about the problems of introducing performance appraisals of a different kind, without scores, right, without numbers. I wouldn't want to be the person leading the defend performance appraisal band, because it is the least popular thing in modern business, right? Everybody hates it. And if you want to stand up and say, we got to keep this most incredibly unpopular thing, and you want to be the champion for that, that's, I don't think, a career-building move.
Just as an aside, when I did want to do this, I had a lot of pushback from my president, screaming at me when I first proposed this. By the time we got done, all I had to ask him was, what kind of ROI have you ever gotten from any performance review process you've ever used?
Yeah.
What comes out of it other than strained relationships, either between the supervisors and the employees, or the employees with each other? How come she got a 5 and I got a 3?
Right.
I do the same job.
Right. It is a big change process to go down. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. So you shouldn't go into it casually if you're going to get rid of this stuff, right? And it's basically an effort to substitute culture for a lot of tick-the-box rules. And that's a big investment to go down, right?
At the first CHRO of the Year Awards dinner, I had complimented, it was Jan Brewer from Autodesk. Jan had essentially done away with the entire process. And Jan Becker did it at a time when it was dangerous to do away with the entire performance review process, and went to an informal meeting cycle between employees and managers. It was very successful, and there was good data around it. But a lot of the audience, and this is only 5 years ago, when I criticized employment review processes, started hissing at me and booing, okay? You were there. And I asked how many people in the room liked the performance review process. Now, Peter has just done a pretty good job of gutting it in front of the crowd, but I'll ask everyone in here, how many people think that it's still a good process to have? Because a lot of HR people do. How many people like the employment review process? Raise your hands if you do. You do? Go home and do one with your wife. Okay? Because that's it. If you think about it, like the interpersonal nature of that interaction is so unpleasant. It's uncomfortable for managers, and it's really unpleasant for employees. So how does that improve retention or improve, how someone feels about the organization when you do it in a very formalized process? So
our top talent turns at about 3.5%. Our lower performing talent, thank you. Our top talent turns at about 3.5%. Our lower performing talent, we have 5 categories, turns at 66. And and most of that's voluntary. And we've it's an ongoing discussion we've kind of established. It's more than quarterly with people, just what we call trust and transparency, basically saying, let's be candid about how you're doing. Let's set up an environment where you're going to be supported and developed. But at some point, if it's not working, let's both understand that so you can make a good career decision or find a place where you're going to be successful. But that requires ongoing dialogue. And that's worked for us. Now, I'm not saying it would work everywhere because of different conditions, but it works for us.
Yeah.
But the ongoing dialogue is different, because that's pretty much the Autodesk model from what I was talking about was the formal annual review process.
Right, so we still have the reason I know these numbers is there's still at some point, rating process, which is formal, but that's an outcome of this ongoing dialogue. So when I have this debate, which I have a lot, it's a little bit of, is the performance appraisal process, the formal process, broken, or does it just need to be fixed or abandoned? And I think there's a continuum there that it's a little bit of a binary discussion that happens, which I don't think is the appropriate discussion to have.
Yeah, no, there are many different parts of this. So, just simply, if you expect that simply taking ratings away is going to make everything better, it certainly won't, right?
But I'll see you at 4 o'clock. We'll talk about how you're doing.
And there are lots of ways you could have, if you have nice continuous conversations with your employees, you probably could give them annual performance appraisal scores, and it's not going to mess things up too much, right? So I think Dave is right. There are several steps involved in the process, and it's not just the having numbers or not having numbers that's the big issue, right?
Well, we are sadly once again out of time, and it's always such a popular session. It gets people thinking about the world differently. I want to thank the folks at Bartek Group for sponsoring the Wharton Track. Some of you may not know that what we do with the Wharton Track sponsorship, and it is unique, in that we donate a portion of that sponsorship to support the ongoing efforts of the Center for Human Resources. I want to thank Professor Peter Cappelli, the director of the Center for Human Resources, for taking part and for a lively dialogue, and thank everyone who sent in questions. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun while you were doing it.
And could I just make a quick plug? The Center for Human Resources was started in 1917. So it's the oldest research center around any business topic in the world. It was started originally as a center for women researchers. And we have groups of employers who come together to talk about different kinds of issues. And we also do research that involves data from companies like yours. So if you'd like to talk to me about it at some point, I'm easy to reach. There's not too many Peter Cappellis. You can just Google me and I pop up. But also you can catch me after this and we can follow up. So thank you all.
All right.